The following narrative is entirely fictional. All characters, locations, events, and investigations described herein were created for storytelling purposes and do not represent any actual person, crime, or case. Any resemblance to real individuals, families, or past events is coincidental. This story explores warning signs, investigative procedures, and the consequences of deception and violence. The following events are products of imagination only. On April 15, 2019, the Brennan family, 4 people living on Cypress Ridge Drive in the quiet suburb of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, ceased to exist in the eyes of their neighbors and the world. They did not flee in the night. They left behind nearly everything they owned. Their cars remained in the garage. Their pets were still in the house. The front door was locked. The house was dark, but something else remained in that house. Something investigators would not discover for 11 days. The question was no longer whether they had vanished. The question was whether they had ever left at all. Settle in wherever you're watching from. Dim the lights if it helps you focus. This is a case that turns on small details, a locked door, a pattern of calls, a single receipt. We'll walk through the evidence as investigators did. Subscribe if you enjoy fictional crime narratives that unfold like real investigation. The Brennan household existed in that particular American geography where suburbs blur into small towns. Millbrook sat 40 miles northwest of Pittsburgh, a community of roughly 12,000 people spread across tree-lined streets and developments built in successive waves from the 1970s onward. Cypress Ridge Drive was one of the older sections, homes ranging from 1,500 to 2,200 square feet. Built for families of moderate means who valued quiet and schools and the assumption that neighbors kept an eye on each other. The Brennans had lived there for 9 years. Thomas Brennan was 51 years old, employed as a senior supervisor at a logistics facility outside the city. He was the kind of man who left for work at 6:45 every morning and returned between 5:15 and 5:45 in the evening. He rarely missed days. He attended his company's safety meetings and had been nominated twice for employee recognition. He was not memorable in a way that attracted attention. He was simply reliable. His wife Margaret was 48. She worked part-time as an office manager for a dental practice 5 days a week, managing appointments and insurance claims with the kind of methodical attention that made the practice run smoothly. Margaret was known for remembering patients' children's names and keeping track of their dental milestones. She was friendly but not effusive. She did not host large parties. She gardened. She attended a book club that met on Wednesday evenings. Their eldest child, Sarah, was 21 years old, and in her junior year at Penn State, studying accounting. She came home most weekends, arriving Friday evening and leaving Sunday afternoon. She called her mother on Wednesday nights and texted her father updates about exams. Their youngest, David, was 17. He attended Millbrook Central High School, where he was a competent but unremarkable student. He worked part-time at a grocery store on weekends. He had a small circle of friends and was described by teachers as pleasant but somewhat withdrawn. None of them attracted attention to themselves. That was their way. The house itself was a 2-story colonial, painted gray with black shutters, set back slightly from the street. A narrow driveway led to a 2-car garage. There was a small front porch and a much larger deck in the back overlooking a wooded lot. The neighborhood was quiet on weekdays. Children rode bikes. Dogs barked at delivery trucks. The streets were emptiest between 8 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. On April 15, 2019, it was a Monday. The weather was cool but clear, a day that suggested spring was genuinely arriving. Thomas went to work at his usual time. Margaret had the day off and intended to run errands and work in her garden. Sarah was at university. David would return from school around 3 o'clock. That was what was supposed to happen. At 9:47 p.m. that Monday evening, Margaret did not call her sister in Columbus, Ohio. This was unusual. She called every Monday evening at approximately 9:45 p.m. They would talk for 15 to 20 minutes about the family, work, and community gossip. The call was reliable enough that Margaret's sister Catherine knew to expect it. Catherine did not worry immediately. She assumed Margaret had forgotten or was occupied with something. She did not call back. It was not their pattern. On Tuesday morning, when Thomas Brennan did not arrive at work, his supervisor sent him 2 text messages by 7:15 a.m. The messages went unanswered. By 8:30 a.m., the supervisor had called the Brennan house. The call went to the answering machine. This was concerning enough that the supervisor considered calling the police, but he hesitated. It seemed presumptuous. He called back at 9:15 a.m., still no answer. At 9:45 a.m., a wellness check was requested. 2 police officers from the Millbrook Police Department arrived at Cypress Ridge Drive at 10:02 a.m. The first thing the officers noticed was that the house appeared empty. The garage door was closed, but it was visible through a small window that both cars were inside. No one answered the front door. One officer, Patricia Gomez, walked around the perimeter of the house and noted that all visible windows were closed and curtains were drawn. The back door was also locked and showed no signs of disturbance. Gomez called for a sergeant and explained the situation. By 10:45 a.m., a supervisor had authorized entry on the grounds of a welfare check. The front door was opened carefully by forcing the frame near the lock. The officers entered slowly, announcing themselves, prepared for any situation from medical emergency to mental health crisis. The house was cold. The living room was dim and quiet. Nothing appeared disturbed. The couch was arranged normally. There were coffee cups in the sink from Monday morning. A newspaper from Monday was on the kitchen table. The officers searched the house methodically. No one was on the first floor. They climbed the stairs. 2 bedroom doors on the second floor were closed. The master bedroom appeared empty. The bathroom door was ajar and empty. The 3rd bedroom, Sarah's room, was empty. The 4th bedroom, David's, was empty. But the house had a basement, and it was the basement that would later dominate every reconstruction of what happened that night. The basement of the Brennan house was finished. It contained a recreation room with a pool table, a small bar area that held only soft drinks and mixed mixers, a second television, and an old sectional couch. There was also a storage room, a furnace room, and a locked door that led to a small workshop area Thomas had created several years earlier. Officer Gomez descended the basement stairs first. The recreation room appeared normal, but then she noticed something that did not fit: a smell. It was faint, chemical, and wrong. It was the smell that changes everything about a case. It was the smell that suggests death. Gomez called out to her partner to remain upstairs. She moved toward the locked workshop door. It was secured with a standard deadbolt, and it was locked. She did not open it immediately. She called for the sergeant to come down. The sergeant, Michael Torres, stood in front of that locked door for approximately 30 seconds. Then he called the dispatcher and requested the presence of detectives in the medical examiner's office. No one opened the door until proper authority, chain of custody, and documentation were established. But every officer who was present that morning would later confirm what they already knew. Whatever was on the other side of that locked door was why the Brennan family had not packed a single bag. They had never intended to leave home at all. By 11:47 a.m., the Millbrook Police Department had secured the house as a potential crime scene. The locked workshop door had not yet been opened. The smell had intensified slightly as the house warmed. No one had touched anything beyond the front door and the staircase. The medical examiner, Dr. Richard Calloway, arrived at 12:15 p.m. He was accompanied by 2 forensic technicians. Detectives James Pritchard and Sarah Kim, the only 2 full-time investigators in the Millbrook Police Department, arrived at 12:41 p.m. Pritchard was 43 years old and had been with the department for 19 years. He had investigated approximately 700 cases, ranging from property theft to assault. He had never worked a quadruple homicide. Kim was 37 and had 11 years of experience with the department. She had worked homicides only twice before, both involving single victims. Neither officer expected what they would find. The locked workshop door was opened at 1:03 p.m. A key was located in Thomas Brennan's dresser drawer upstairs, confirming that the lock was intentional. The door swung inward to reveal a small, climate-controlled space approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, designed originally as a workshop. It contained a workbench, shelves of tools, and, in a position that suggested arrangement rather than accident, 4 human remains in various states of decomposition. The bodies were positioned on the floor in close proximity to one another. They were covered partially with a plastic tarp. There were no obvious signs of violence on immediate visual inspection, though all autopsies would later be required to determine cause of death. The oldest body, positioned somewhat apart, was identified shortly thereafter as Thomas Brennan. The second oldest body, positioned closest to Thomas, was Margaret Brennan. The remaining two bodies were quickly identified as Sarah and David Brennan, though Sarah's body showed obvious signs of having been subjected to conditions after death that made her deterioration more advanced than the others. The discovery of four bodies in a locked room in their own home changed the fundamental nature of the investigation. This was no disappearance, this was murder, multiple murders. And the locked door suggested that someone had deliberately confined them together after death, in the dark, in their own house, sealed away from the world above. The question was no longer where is the Brennan family. The question was who did this and how were they standing in that workshop, in their own home, while the world above assumed they had vanished. Investigators established immediately that the house had not been broken into. All entry points showed no signs of forced entry. The windows were locked from the inside. The garage was sealed. The alarm system, which the family had installed 6 years earlier, showed no evidence of being armed on the night of April 15th or in the 48 hours prior. Phone records would later show no incoming or outgoing calls after 3:17 p.m. on April 15th, when Sarah had texted her father that she was catching a ride back to university. But Sarah Brennan had never made it back to university. The cell phone records for all four family members would occupy much of the first 72 hours of investigation. Detective Kim took the lead on digital forensics. She requested immediate analysis of all devices found in the home. 3 smartphones, a laptop belonging to Sarah, and a desktop computer in the home office that Thomas used for personal finances. What the initial examination revealed was that no electronic devices had been used after 6:45 p.m. on April 15th. The last activity was on the desktop computer, where Thomas had been reviewing bank statements at 6:31 p.m. The last message sent from any of the phones was Sarah's text to her father at 3:17 p.m. stating that a friend was giving her a ride back to Penn State and that she would text when she arrived. Sarah never texted that she had arrived. By 8:30 p.m. that evening, the investigation had already acquired a crucial timeline. All four family members had been inside the house as of 6:45 p.m. At least one of them had been alive and conscious as of 6:31 p.m., operating the computer. By 9 p.m., according to the cell towers that would later be examined, none of the phones had moved from the property. They remained in the house. They stayed in the house for the next 11 days, in pockets and bags, continuing to transmit location signals that placed the entire family at 427 Cypress Ridge Drive, generating the background radiation of digital presence that might have seemed to verify, to any casual observer, that the Brennans were home. But the Brennans were not home. They were in a locked workshop in the basement, surrounded by tools and darkness and the chemistry of decay. The autopsies were conducted over the following 3 days at the county medical examiner's office in Pittsburgh. Dr. Calloway worked with a forensic pathologist from the University of Pittsburgh Medical School to establish cause and approximate time of death. The results were troubling and contradictory. Thomas Brennan had died of acute blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a heavy instrument, possibly a hammer or similar tool. The injuries suggested at least 3 separate blows. Time of death was estimated at April 15th or early April 16th, approximately 6 to 18 hours prior to discovery. Margaret Brennan had died of asphyxiation. There were small hemorrhages in her eyes and discoloration consistent with strangulation or suffocation. A bruise pattern on her neck suggested hands, not a ligature. Time of death was estimated at April 15th or April 16th, in the same window as Thomas. David Brennan had died of acute blunt force trauma to the head, similar to his father. The injuries were less severe but followed a similar pattern. Time of death was estimated in the same window, but Sarah Brennan presented a different problem. Sarah's body showed signs of significantly more decomposition than the others, suggesting that she had died earlier. However, all 4 bodies had been stored in the same space with comparable environmental conditions. The accelerated decomposition of Sarah's remains suggested that she had been exposed to conditions that accelerated putrefaction, possibly that her body had been disturbed or moved separately at some point. Additionally, Sarah had evidence of both blunt force trauma and asphyxiation. The pattern of injuries was inconsistent with the strikes to her brothers. The wounds to her skull were less severe but more numerous, suggesting multiple strikes from different angles or different implements. The asphyxiation damage suggested that she had been strangled, like her mother, though the bruise pattern was less defined. The forensic pathologist's preliminary conclusion, presented to Detective Pritchard on April 18th, was haunting. Sarah Brennan had been the last to die. The investigation immediately pivoted to a central question. How could a 21-year-old university student be found dead in her parents' basement when multiple witnesses could verify that she had been alive on April 15th at 3:17 p.m., texting her father about her ride back to Penn State? The answer to that question would require the reconstruction of every moment of April 15th. Sarah had indeed left Penn State on April 15th. Her roommate Jessica Hartley confirmed that Sarah had packed an overnight bag and said she was heading home to spend a few days with her family before returning to school. This was not unusual. Sarah returned home most weekends. She had last spoken to Jessica at 2:45 p.m. on April 15th. But Sarah had never arrived at Penn State on April 16th. Her Monday morning accounting lecture was missed. Her professor sent an automated reminder about the absence. By Tuesday morning, when she did not appear for her 9 a.m. class, her academic advisor had already noted 3 consecutive missed appointments. The question was, had Sarah actually left Penn State on April 15th, or had she never left? Investigators contacted Penn State campus security and requested surveillance footage from the parking areas and dormitory exits from April 15th. The footage was collected and reviewed by Detective Kim over a 12-hour period. What it revealed was startling. Sarah Brennan's car, a silver 2016 Honda Civic, had remained in the dormitory parking lot from April 13th through at least April 17th. Security cameras captured no images of anyone entering or leaving the vehicle during that period. Sarah had not driven home from Penn State. She had not driven anywhere. Her car had never left campus. But her text message to her father at 3:17 p.m. stated that a friend was giving her a ride. Investigators immediately contacted Jessica Hartley again and pressed for details. Had Sarah actually left with someone, or had she sent a message that was not reflective of her actual location? Jessica's statement was confusing. She said that Sarah had left her dormitory room at approximately 2:50 p.m. on April 15th with an overnight bag. But she had not seen Sarah leave the building. She had simply gone to bed after Sarah said she was going to call for a ride. When she woke up, Sarah was gone. She assumed that Sarah had already left for home. No one had actually confirmed that Sarah had left campus. No one had seen her get into a car. The text message at 3:17 p.m. was the only evidence that she had departed. Detective Pritchard submitted a warrant for all cell phone records associated with Sarah, with particular attention to location data. If Sarah had left campus, the cell phone tower data should show movement from Penn State toward Millbrook. If her phone had remained at Penn State, it would place the lie directly on the text message. The results returned within 72 hours. Sarah's phone had remained at Penn State until 4:23 p.m. on April 15th. At 4:23 p.m., the phone's signal had relocated from the campus area to a cell tower on the route between Penn State and Millbrook. Between 4:25 p.m. and 4:47 p.m., the phone had pinged 4 separate cell towers in a geographic pattern consistent with rapid travel via Interstate 180 toward Route 322 in the direction of Millbrook. At 4:48 p.m. the phone had disappeared from cell tower data. The signal had not reappeared until 6:31 p.m., when it registered at the Brennan home address. The last geographic ping was from a cell tower near a rural area approximately 4 miles from the Brennan house. The signal had jumped from that tower directly to the tower serving the Millbrook residential area without intermediate pings. What that data told investigators was that Sarah's phone had been transported by vehicle from Penn State to somewhere near the Brennan home, then had arrived at the house at approximately 6:31 p.m. on April 15th. That Sarah was supposed to have called for a ride at 3:17 p.m. Her phone data showed that she did not leave Penn State until after 4:23 p.m. Whoever had sent that text message at 3:17 p.m. was not Sarah Brennan. Investigators subpoenaed Sarah's phone records going back 3 months. They examined every text she had sent and every message she had received. They looked for patterns in her language, her abbreviations, her response times, her typical messages to her father. The text at 3:17 p.m. on April 15th read, Dad getting a ride back now, friend picking me up, will text when I get there. Sarah's typical texts to her father were more formal. She used periods, she capitalized properly. In her previous 5 months of text communication, she had never sent her father a message lacking proper punctuation or capitalization. She had never used the word dad without a comma or proper structure. The deviation was subtle but significant. The text did not sound like Sarah, when she had not actually left until much later, possibly not willingly. The investigation now branched into the question of Sarah's companions at Penn State, who had access to her dormitory room, who had contact with her on April 15th, who might have had motivation to send a false message on her behalf. Jessica Hartley had been Sarah's roommate for the entire academic year. She was questioned extensively about Sarah's habits, friendships, and concerns. Jessica reported that Sarah was a quiet, dedicated student who did not date anyone, did not attend large parties, and spent most of her time either in classes or in the dormitory room studying. But Jessica also provided a detail that redirected the investigation entirely. 3 weeks prior to April 15th, Sarah's father Thomas had driven to Penn State and had picked Sarah up for a weekend at home. During that weekend, Jessica said, Sarah had seemed stressed and worried when she returned. Sarah had been unusually quiet for several days after returning to campus, and Sarah had spent a large amount of time on her laptop, looking at things Jessica could not see from her angle, closing the screen whenever Jessica approached. Investigators immediately subpoenaed Sarah's laptop and requested computer forensics analysis. The device was sent to a specialized digital forensics laboratory in Pittsburgh. The results would arrive 5 days later. Sarah's laptop contained a hidden folder buried 3 levels deep in the system files, accessible only if someone knew the precise pathway to locate it. The folder contained approximately 300 photographs, images that had been carefully concealed and organized by date. The photographs were of her father, Thomas Brennan, but not photographs that Sarah had taken. These were photographs that had been taken of Thomas in what appeared to be business meetings, social settings, and private moments. Photographed by someone else, collected by someone else, and placed on Sarah's laptop. Many of the photographs appeared to span a period of several years. Some showed Thomas with people who were not his family, some showed him with documents or paperwork, some showed him in environments that did not appear to be his work facility or home. But one photograph, dated March 20th of the previous year, showed Thomas Brennan in the parking lot of a casino 90 minutes north of Millbrook, appearing to exchange an envelope with a man who would later be identified as Marcus Holloway, a local cocaine distributor with a history of violent crime spanning 18 years. Investigators immediately obtained images of Holloway and showed them to Detective Kim. The man in the photograph with Thomas was unquestionably Marcus Holloway. The case had just transformed again. This was no longer simply a family homicide. This was now a case involving criminal conspiracy, possible drug trafficking, and a family caught in the consequences of a secret no one had known existed. Detective Pritchard obtained a warrant to place Marcus Holloway under surveillance and submitted a second warrant to examine Thomas Brennan's financial records over the prior 5 years. What the financial examination revealed was a pattern of cash withdrawals that did not correspond to any legitimate expenses the family had incurred. Over a 3-year period, Thomas Brennan had withdrawn approximately $47,000 in cash from the family accounts. These were not large withdrawals, typically between $300 and $800 per withdrawal, made at irregular intervals, sometimes twice in a week, sometimes with gaps of several weeks. But when totaled, they represented a significant hemorrhage of family money. Thomas's income as a logistics supervisor was approximately $68,000 per year. Margaret's part-time dental office income was approximately $22,000 per year. The family's combined income would be approximately $90,000 annually. The cash withdrawals represented more than 50% of discretionary income over the 3-year period. The family had not taken any vacations. They had not renovated their home. They had not purchased new vehicles. The missing money had been going somewhere, and the photographs suggested it had been going to Marcus Holloway. Investigators now widened the scope of the surveillance on Holloway and submitted additional warrants for his phone records and bank accounts. What emerged over the next 72 hours was a picture of sophisticated money laundering and debt collection operations involving approximately 15 individuals across 3 counties. Thomas Brennan was connected to this network through a single transaction on March 20th of the previous year. On that date, Thomas had apparently received a substantial loan from Marcus Holloway. The investigators estimated approximately $12,000 based on indirect financial evidence, and had begun repaying it through regular cash withdrawals. But loans from men like Marcus Holloway do not carry traditional terms. They carry interest that compounds rapidly. They carry obligations. They carry consequences for failure to pay. And Thomas Brennan, according to financial records that would later emerge, had begun falling behind on those repayments approximately 2 months before his death. Marcus Holloway was brought in for questioning on April 19, 2019. He was advised of his rights and was informed that he was being questioned in connection with the deaths of the Brennan family. He was shown the photograph from the parking lot of the casino. Holloway's response was measured. He acknowledged that he knew Thomas Brennan. He acknowledged that the photograph might be from a business meeting, but he maintained that the business was entirely legal, a private lending arrangement between 2 men, now concluded. He was asked about the nature of the loan. Holloway stated that Thomas had come to him in March of the previous year requesting a short-term personal loan. Holloway had agreed to loan him $12,000 at an interest rate of 18% annually, which would require repayment of approximately $1,000 per month for 13 months. This was, Holloway claimed, a standard business arrangement. He had many clients. Thomas had been repaying reliably until recently. He was asked about the most recent repayment. Holloway stated that Thomas had made his last payment on March 18th. He had been scheduled to make his final payment on April 15th. That payment had never come. He had attempted to contact Thomas on April 16th, April 17th, and April 18th. He had received no response. He was asked where he was on the night of April 15th. Holloway provided an alibi. He had been at a poker game in a private residence in Mount Pleasant, approximately 35 minutes from Millbrook. He had arrived at 8 p.m. and had remained until 2:30 a.m. There were 7 witnesses who could verify his presence. All 7 had provided corroborating statements by the time of this interrogation. He was asked what he would have done if Thomas had failed to make the final payment. Holloway's response was chilling. "I would have come to his house and collected it personally." But Holloway's alibi was solid. The 7 witnesses were not associates with criminal histories. They included a nurse, an accountant, a retired teacher, and others with no obvious connection to Holloway's business. They had been interviewed independently and had all confirmed Holloway's presence throughout the evening. This created a fundamental problem for the investigation. The man who had the clearest motive to harm the Brennan family could not have done so because he had an airtight alibi for the time of death. Detectives Pritchard and Kim now faced the most difficult question in the case. If not Marcus Holloway, then who? The investigation had proven that 1. The 4 family members had been inside the house as of 6:31 p.m. on April 15th. 2. None of them had left the house after that time, based on cell phone data. 3. All 4 had been killed sometime between 6:31 p.m. on April 15th and 10 a.m. on April 16th, based on autopsy evidence. 4. The killer had deliberately locked the bodies in the workshop and sealed the door. 5. The killer had access to the house, knew where the workshop was, and knew where the key was kept. 6. The killer had then managed to leave the house without being observed by neighbors, and had gone undiscovered for 11 days. The investigation expanded to include everyone who had ever had access to the house. This included Sarah's boyfriend if she had one, she did not, David's close friends, Thomas's colleagues, Margaret's book club friends, contractors who had performed work at the house, neighbors who had been given keys, and family members who had visited. Each person was questioned. Each person's movements on April 15th were examined. Each person's relationship with the family was scrutinized for motive. And then, on April 23rd, Detective Kim received a phone call from a forensic technician at the laboratory examining the house for trace evidence. The technician had found something in the workshop that changed the direction of the investigation once again. The object was small and had been overlooked during the initial search. It was a watch, a man's watch with a stainless steel band and a black face. The watch had been located on the workbench, partially hidden beneath a stack of papers and sketches related to woodworking projects. The watch was brought to Detective Pritchard. He examined it carefully. The back of the watch was engraved with initials RB, 2009. RB did not match any name in the family. Thomas's initials were TB Margaret's, were MB Sarah's, were SB David's, were DB. But Pritchard knew someone whose initials were RB, though he had to go back to his initial interviews to confirm it. Robert Brennan was Thomas's brother. He lived in Ohio, approximately 4 hours from Millbrook. He had not been considered a serious person of interest in the investigation, partly because of the distance and partly because his alibi for April 15th had appeared solid. He was at work at a manufacturing facility in Columbus on the evening in question, and his time card had been clocked in until 6 p.m. But a watch engraved with his initials had been left in the workshop where 4 people died. Detectives Pritchard and Kim drove to Columbus and appeared at Robert Brennan's workplace on April 24th. Robert was a maintenance technician at a manufacturing facility, responsible for equipment repair and facility upkeep. He was 49 years old, 9 years younger than his brother Thomas. He was removed from his workstation and was informed that detectives needed to question him regarding the death of his brother and family. Robert's initial reaction was shock and confusion. He asked for details about what had happened. When told that his family had been killed on April 15th, he became emotional. But when shown the watch and told that it had been found at the crime scene, something changed in his demeanor. Robert requested an attorney before answering any further questions. The interview was suspended, and the detectives returned to Millbrook to obtain an arrest warrant. The warrant was granted based on the presence of Robert's personal property at the crime scene. Robert Brennan was arrested on April 24th at 4:47 p.m. and was transported to the county jail in Pittsburgh to await arraignment. The investigation now shifted into examining Robert's movements and circumstances more carefully. Detectives discovered information that had not been surfaced in the initial questioning. 1. Robert's marriage had ended in divorce 3 years earlier. The divorce had been contentious and had involved disputes over property and financial obligations. 2. Robert had borrowed money from Thomas approximately 2 years prior, approximately $8,000, to cover legal fees associated with the divorce. He had never repaid this loan. 3. Thomas had begun pressing Robert for repayment starting approximately 6 months before his death. Text messages between the brothers showed increasing tension, with Thomas using language that suggested anger and frustration about the money. 4. Robert had approached Thomas on 3 separate occasions in the months prior to April 15th, requesting either an extension or a forgiveness of the debt. Thomas had refused all 3 requests. 5. Robert had been placed on probation at his workplace for attendance issues approximately 4 weeks prior to the murders. His job was in jeopardy. 6. Robert's financial situation was deteriorating. He was behind on child support obligations to his ex-wife, which Thomas had also learned about and had expressed disapproval of. 7. Most significantly, Robert had taken vacation days from his job on April 15th and April 16th. His time card showed that he had clocked out at 6 p.m. on April 14th and had not returned until April 17th. The solid alibi of a clocked-in time card had been incorrect. Robert had left work early on April 15th and had taken days off that suggested premeditation for the murders. When detectives reviewed security footage from Robert's workplace, they discovered that Robert had left the facility at 4:12 p.m. on April 15th, not at 6 p.m. Someone else's time card had been clocked in after his departure, a pattern of time card fraud that Robert had apparently engaged in with the assistance of a co-worker. Robert could have driven from Columbus to Millbrook, a 4-hour drive, and could have arrived at his brother's house at approximately 8:15 p.m. on April 15th. Detectives now reconstructed the probable timeline. Robert arrived at the Brennan house sometime between 8 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. on April 15th. He had a key to the house, given to him years earlier for emergency purposes. He used this key to enter the home. Thomas was likely in the home office, having used the computer at 6:31 p.m. Margaret might have been in the living room or kitchen. Sarah and David were likely upstairs or in their respective rooms. The attack on Thomas occurred first. Based on the severity of the head injuries and the positioning of the body, investigators believed that Robert had confronted Thomas in the home office and had attacked him with a hammer retrieved from the workshop. Thomas had suffered at least 3 blows and had likely died quickly. Margaret had heard the commotion and had come downstairs. Robert had attacked her next, or had confronted her, and had strangled her with his bare hands. The struggle had been physical, evidenced by the bruising pattern. But it was Sarah and David who presented the most troubling aspect of the reconstruction. Sarah was believed to have been home despite the false text message indicating she was at Penn State. Investigators developed the theory that Sarah had been picked up from Penn State, not by a friend, but by Robert himself, or with Robert's involvement. Sarah may have been brought home deliberately, or may have been tricked into returning home by a false emergency message. David had been at school but would have returned home at approximately 3:30 p.m. When David arrived at the house, he would have encountered his father dead, his mother dead or dying, and his uncle Robert present with a weapon. David had been attacked with a similar hammer or blunt instrument, suffering multiple head blows. He had died quickly, but Sarah had died last. Based on the autopsy evidence showing more advanced decomposition, investigators believe that Sarah had been killed some hours after the initial murders, possibly after prolonged confrontation or struggle. She had been both struck and strangled, suggesting more desperate violence. The theory was that Sarah had discovered the bodies of her family, had confronted Robert, and had fought him. Robert had struck her repeatedly and then had strangled her, ensuring her death. All 4 bodies had then been placed in the locked workshop, the door had been secured, and Robert had left the house. He had then returned to Columbus and had implemented a fraud scheme with his co-worker to establish a false time card record of his presence at work. Robert Brennan was arraigned on April 26, 2019. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty. His attorney, a public defender named James Morrison, indicated that they would pursue a defense based on insufficient evidence and would demand that the prosecution prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. The case went to trial on August 12, 2019, nearly 4 months after the murders. The prosecution's case, presented by the district attorney's office, relied on several key pieces of evidence. First, the watch found at the crime scene, engraved with Robert's initials, was presented as evidence of his presence at the house. Robert claimed he had lost the watch months earlier and had no idea how it came to be at his brother's house. Second, cell phone records showing that Robert's phone had pinged cell towers consistent with travel from Columbus to Millbrook on the evening of April 15. Robert's defense argued that the cell phone data was inconclusive and could be consistent with multiple routes. Third, time card fraud at Robert's workplace, which suggested consciousness of guilt and provided opportunity for the murders. The defense argued that time card fraud was a relatively minor matter and did not prove anything about Robert's involvement in the murders. Fourth, the testimony of Robert's co-worker, who had agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for immunity from fraud charges. The co-worker testified that Robert had asked him to falsify the time card on April 15 and April 16, stating only that he needed personal time off, and had asked the co-worker to help him cover it up. Fifth, financial motive. Robert's debt to Thomas, his employment problems, and his financial pressures. The prosecution argued that Robert had killed his family in a desperate act to escape financial obligations and humiliation. Sixth, the watch. Presented again and again as evidence of premeditation and presence. But the defense mounted several counter-arguments. The watch could have been planted. The crime scene had been unsecured for nearly 12 hours before police arrived, and the house had been searched by multiple officers before forensic analysis had been conducted. The watch could have been introduced by anyone. The cell phone data was inconclusive and inconsistent. Multiple routes from Columbus to Millbrook could produce similar cell tower pings. Time card fraud did not prove murder. Many employees engaged in time card manipulation. The co-worker's testimony was suspect because the co-worker had received immunity and had motivation to implicate Robert to secure that immunity. The financial motive was circumstantial. Many people had financial problems. Most did not resort to murder, and most damaging to the prosecution's case. There was no physical evidence placing Robert at the crime scene. There was no DNA evidence from the bodies. There were no fingerprints. There were no blood spatter patterns connecting Robert to the scene. There was no forensic evidence of any kind beyond the watch. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 days. On September 2, 2019, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. Robert Brennan was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution at Graterford, where he continues to maintain his innocence and to claim that the watch was planted. But the case did not end with Robert's conviction. New questions emerged that suggested the investigation had not explored all possibilities. 1 month after Robert's conviction, a detail surfaced in a routine follow-up investigation that would haunt the detectives for years. Sarah Brennan's laptop, which had been examined and which had revealed the photographs of Thomas meeting with Marcus Holloway, also contained email correspondence that investigators had initially overlooked. Sarah had been in contact with Marcus Holloway via encrypted email for approximately 6 months prior to her death. The emails had been deleted, but they were recovered during forensic analysis. Their content was disturbing. Marcus had been threatening Thomas regarding the unpaid loan. But more specifically, Marcus had been threatening Sarah. Marcus had written in one email, "Your father thinks he can ignore his obligations. He should know that everyone he cares about becomes a problem when he ignores me." In another email, Marcus had written, "Your dad needs to understand that I know where you are. I know where your family is. I know where your school is. I know what car you drive." Sarah had not reported these threats to police. She had not told her parents. The emails showed no indication that she had discussed them with anyone. Instead, Sarah had been gathering information. She had taken photographs of Thomas meeting with Marcus. She had documented the meetings. She had created a detailed timeline of Thomas's interactions with Marcus Holloway. Detective Kim reviewed all of this new material and brought it to Pritchard with a disturbing hypothesis. What if Robert Brennan had not acted alone? What if Marcus Holloway, unable to collect his debt from Thomas, had involved Robert in a scheme to harm Thomas or his family as punishment? But Marcus's alibi for the night of April 15th was impeccable. He had been at the poker game continuously from 8 p.m. to 2:30 a.m. 7 independent witnesses had confirmed this. And there was no evidence that Marcus had ever been to the Brennan house, had ever met Robert Brennan, or had any connection to Robert beyond his business dealings with Thomas. The alternative hypothesis was that Robert Brennan, aware of Thomas's debts to Marcus Holloway, and aware of the threatening emails Sarah had shown him, or that he had discovered, had decided to murder his family to prevent Marcus from harming them, and to escape the debt obligation entirely. This hypothesis was supported by the fact that Robert would have had knowledge of Thomas's involvement with Marcus. Thomas had likely confided in his brother about the loans and the growing pressure he was under. Robert might have believed that he was in a sense rescuing his family from a worse fate at Marcus's hands. But this hypothesis rested on speculation rather than evidence. It was a theory that fit the facts but could not be definitively proven. What remained unquestionably true was this. The Brennan family had been destroyed not by one force, but by multiple forces converging at a single moment. Thomas's involvement with Marcus Holloway, Robert's financial desperation, Sarah's documentation of threats, the family's isolation and the lack of communication between family members about the dangers they were facing.
Bafkafkat mesin station sasen sanpedajat beorfen song sista jason storas adosan so stone os tista beta the say of me
But the pathways to that locked door extended backward through time, involving debt, threat, secrecy, desperation, and the fundamental human decision to resort to violence. In the years following Robert's conviction, the Millbrook community struggled to make sense of what had happened. The Brennan house at 427 Cypress Ridge Drive remained unsold for 2 years. Eventually it was purchased by a developer who demolished it entirely. A small green space now occupies the lot. Thomas Brennan's former employer established a scholarship fund in his name. Margaret Brennan's book club donated her collection of books to the local library. Sarah and David's names were added to the Millbrook High School Memorial Garden. though David had not attended the high school, and the memorial served more as a community acknowledgement of loss than as an accurate reflection of their lives. Marcus Holloway was eventually convicted on unrelated racketeering and drug trafficking charges and is serving a 22-year sentence in federal prison. He has never been charged in connection with the Brennan murders, and investigators have never located evidence of direct involvement in the crime. Robert Brennan has filed 2 appeals, both of which have been denied. In his appeals, he has continued to maintain that the watch was planted and that he did not murder his family. He has not provided any alternative explanation for how his watch came to be at the crime scene, nor has he provided details about his movements on April 15 that would establish an alibi. The case was officially closed in December of 2019. Detective Pritchard retired from the police department in 2021. Detective Kim continues to work in the department, though she has avoided taking cases similar to the Brennan investigation. In interviews years later, both detectives would acknowledge that the case left unanswered questions. Why had Sarah been killed last, and separately? Why had Robert kept the watch with him at the crime scene rather than removing it? If Robert had planned to frame someone else, why had he left such obvious evidence? And what exactly was his relationship to Marcus Holloway? Was he aware of the threats? Had he been threatened as well? These questions have never been fully resolved. They remain like the watch in the locked workshop, objects that suggest presence and intention but do not provide complete clarity. What the case reveals, ultimately, is not a simple narrative of one man's violence, but rather the consequences of hidden lives intersecting at a single point of crisis. Thomas Brennan had kept his involvement with Marcus Holloway secret from his family. Robert Brennan had kept his financial desperation and his anger over the unpaid debt hidden from his brother. Sarah had kept the threatening emails hidden from her parents, believing perhaps that she could handle the situation alone. David had simply been present, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each family member had constructed a separate reality. Each had kept secrets. Each had decided, independently, that certain information should not be shared. And in the basement of the house on Cypress Ridge Drive, those separate realities collided in a space that was deliberately locked away from the world above. The locked door was not merely a concealment. It was, in a sense, the physical manifestation of the psychological barriers that had separated this family from one another and from help. They were, literally, sealed together in darkness. And they had placed themselves there, not through the lock on the workshop door, but through the locks they had placed on their own voices.